Welcome to the School of Batman, a podcast where we ask academics to help Batman fight crime using their research. I'm your host, Chris George, amateur scientist and professional Batman enthusiast. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the origins of the Batsuit itself. We're pleased to be joined by Yaser Sheikh, who has a PhD in computer vision from the University of Central Florida, and in 2008 completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Carnegie Mellon University, where he is currently an associate professor at the Robotics Institute. Yaser, we like to start the podcast with a bit of background on yourself, your journey, what inspired your choices, what you're interested in as a child. How did you get to be in the position you are in today?
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So I guess that would make me a professional scientist and an amateur Batman enthusiast. So hopefully we'll have a good conversation. My background. So I grew up in, I'm originally from Pakistan, and I grew up in the Middle East. And the Middle East is an interesting place as it's kind of largely an immigrant community. And one of the things looking back at my childhood, I think, is there was a sort of a dearth of scientific role models in that part of the world. And perhaps I got lucky because early on my mother would encourage me to do a lot of reading. And she gave me a book that was titled The 100 Most Influential People in History by Michael Hart. And it had a fair number of scientists who I read with a great interest, the work they'd done. And I just started, I was fascinated by the work of some of the scientific giants in history. I took a liking to reading about their work, and in class it just sort of took off from there. I'd read a lot, and I think that's where the start happened.
Great. And can you talk a little bit more about some of your journey through academia, what you studied, maybe as you were coming into higher education?
My interest was actually in high school. I wanted to do work in sociology. But unfortunately, for some reason, I ended up doing something similar called electronics engineering. Obviously, no relationship whatsoever. And after that, I actually went and I got very interested in imaging and the process of visual perception, how we see, and not just how our eyes work, but how intrinsically the mind is related to vision.
And what kind of year would this have been?
This was 2000 to 2001, actually. That's around the time that it was. There was a professor visiting at the university I was in Pakistan, and he asked me if I was interested in doing a PhD, and I said I was. So I applied, and I joined him in Orlando. And I recall it was something where you find your place or your kind of your thing to do in life, and that's how I felt with research. Much more than anything else I'd done before. The challenge of not just wrestling with answering questions, but trying to figure out what the right questions themselves are to ask, and particularly in a subject that fascinated me, which was visual perception. That was really like a sea change in my life. That was a point where it was clear to me this is what I want to do for the rest of my life.
And what was the status of the kind of research and industry in visual perception at that time? Was it quite established? Was it an emergent field?
So there's an interesting story that in the 1960s, there was a professor at MIT, Marvin Minsky. Actually, there were two. One of them was Marvin Minsky. They were working on artificial intelligence, and they decided that visual perception was something that needed to be solved. So they decided that they would assign one undergraduate over a summer and solve that problem. 30 years later, 40 years later, it was still not solved and nowhere near solved. And the lesson learned from that entire 40-year period was that visual perception is something we do effortlessly all the time. We just look, and our brains are incredibly efficient in sort of, breaking down the immense information we see with our eyes into things we understand. And so we have this impression that it's actually computationally simple, but it's an incredibly complex process. And back when I started, it was profoundly unsolved. There was almost nothing worked well. There were lots of interesting, exciting problems. It was very much the Wild West as a research area. These days, 15 years hence, it's much better understood, even though there are many open problems. And in the interim between visual perception, what the specific problem I started to pay attention to was that there is something particular about the way we see other people. The way I look at you when we're speaking, I respond to you. There are all sorts of subtle momentary signals that you're sending me with the way you smile, the way you look, how you gesticulate with your hands and your body. All of these social signals are integral to the way we communicate. And it's very clear that while you and I are very good at interpreting one another's social signals, machines are completely blind to them, and that's why machines are largely tools that we use, and they're not partners and collaborators like other people can be. And so that's the specific space of research that I'm interested in exploring, which is how do we endow machines with the ability to sense, interpret, understand what we mean and what we attempt to communicate consciously and subconsciously by our behavior and our voice.
Looking back over your time in research, would you say that you preferred working in that real Wild West unknown environment, or do you prefer researching in a more mature space?
That's a really interesting question. Now, there are obviously things I like about both areas. In the current environment, there is the pleasure of the sense of accomplishment, meaning we get things, they actually work. There's interest in the industry. There's interest in the popular press, because we're actually building stuff that for the first time actually has the chance of working, deploying, affecting people's lives. That's incredibly exciting. In the earlier times, what was a lot of fun was this kind of open space where it was a really kind of flat environment. Anyone could have an idea. Anyone's idea could be the one that made an impact. And there was a lot of free exploration. There was a lot less ideology and dogma, because obviously, nobody could really clearly demonstrate one thing was better than the other. So that part of it I did enjoy too. That there was a lot more about ideas and originality, which is lost a little bit. And I don't think that's a bad thing, but it's something which I do feel was exciting as well.
That seems to be a theme kind of running through machine and artificial intelligence, and that to the layman, the things that would appear to be simple and you would take for granted counterintuitively are the most difficult things, and tremendously difficult, highly specialized tasks machines often seem to excel at. Why do you think that kind of layman counterintuitive thing seems to be a reality?
So this is going to be maybe an imprecise answer to the question, but if we were to take a view of mental processes as layers of abstraction, right? And the layer of abstraction that we are consciously aware of is our kind of logical, reasoned thinking, most aware of, right? How we consciously think about things. But that's only one of many layers. And most of the things that we do, which are manual, which are so-called easy or non-complex, those tend to be the early abstraction layers. So how do we plan to pick up a piece of an apple or push open a door? These are things which we're not kind of consciously planning on moving every muscle of every finger. It just sort of happens. It's not a conscious act. Since we're not consciously aware of them, it's been difficult to actually design or reverse engineer what the underlying algorithms or principles are to drive them. And we often kind of don't realize how complex those tasks are, as we just mentioned. They're interdependent. They can't be easily broken down. There are lots of processes that work in concert together. So I think the fact that we're not conscious, that we are conscious about some things, and the things we're conscious about, it's been easier to design other systems to replicate that behavior. The stuff that we're not conscious about, it's been difficult to introspect and figure out how to engineer systems that do that.
Great, thank you. I think it's now time that we start with a story. So for your story, we always ask our guests to choose their Batman that they would like to represent their Batman in their story. Have you got a choice?
Oh, there's only one. It has to be Kevin Conroy from Batman the Animated Series. He's the canonical voice of Batman.
So after many years spent travelling around the world, training and learning as much as he can, Bruce Wayne returns to Gotham to fight crime. Knowing he must keep his identity secret, he goes out in disguise, but it is not enough. He decides to become a bat and begins to build a suit in keeping. Knowing that he must be more than a man, Bruce begins to explore the very limits of technology to grant him new insights of the world around him. So in this story, Bruce has gone out fighting crime in a balaclava and realised that being just a man is not enough to take on the world around him. And utilising his fortunes and utilising his research that he has access to, he's going to build a Batsuit. So how would you be able to help if Bruce Wayne came to you and said, "What can you give me for my suit, Yaser?"
So in the midst of a full pitch battle, what Bruce Wayne can't be doing is sort of using voice commands and saying Batsuit do this and Batsuit do that. The Batsuit has to be part of his body, right? It has to be able to understand and interpret, every subtle gesture of every part of his body. And so what I think we would work together on, I imagine, is how we could have the Batsuit be aware of every subtle movement of his fingers, his arms, his legs, his toes, and his face. So it interprets and seamlessly partners with him in doing the incredible acrobatics that he does.
So how would that work? So that to me sounds like something, I wouldn't even know. Would that be cameras? Would that be sensors? And what degrees of finesse could you expect?
So I think the right way to approach problems in research is to ask what's needed to solve the problem, right? And cameras, although that is my kind of core expertise, is almost certainly not going to be sufficient. I think we would have to look at, what would actually give us the ability to measure his movement at the highest precision. So it could even be something like a tactile sensing surface, which sort of interfaces directly with his body and measures movement. There could be cameras on his bat helmet looking at his face. Almost certainly there'd be some analysis of course, what he says, how he says it. I would definitely go with heavy on the diversity of sensors.
Right. And thinking about some of the advances that you've looked at in machine vision, is there anything we could bring there, maybe with studying crowds or analysing people's intent, or analysing whether someone's telling the truth, feeling like whether a crowd is going to swell into a riot, or what could be done?
Absolutely. So, of course, all of us, even mere mortals and Batman, both just have two eyes and can only pay attention to one thing at a time. The Batsuit itself could have sensors, cameras, looking outwards, looking at the crowd, as you're saying, to see if there's any threat or if something's brewing there, or at other people in the scene who Batman himself may not be able to see if they're a threat. Maybe warn him if there's a three-way, four-way multiple attack, and so forth.
So how would you be able to pick out the potential of, say, someone who is imminent in a crowd who's going to cause some harm, would there be giveaways in their body language that you might be too subtle for the human eyes to pick up? And how would you go about training machine to do that very task?
So in fact, one of the things we talked about earlier was the feeling of the Wild West in computer vision. And I think this understanding body language, what's called in the popular imagination body language, it's also another, it's another Wild West actually. And understanding what the vocabulary, what the syntax, what the morphology, what the grammar of this language, even if these words even make sense, is something which we're still exploring. So it would certainly be, having machines first of all have the ability to measure people's movements at the fidelity that we just talked about, and then capturing thousands of people interacting and letting systems themselves see if they can discover a language, can discover the structure of the underlying language. And this is precisely what we're doing at Carnegie Mellon. We've built a studio called the Panoptic Studio. It's a dome-like structure about 6 meters in diameter, and it has a few hundred cameras all over the surface of the dome looking inwards. And when anyone comes in, or a group comes in and interacts, we can capture and reconstruct their movements at a greater degree of fidelity than has ever been possible before. And the purpose of this this research that we're doing is exactly what you said. It's to be able to figure out what does an intent mean. How do we convert these measurements of movement into a computational representation that machines such as the Batsuit can actually access, analyze, react to, and provide feedback from.
And would the inverse of that be true, to say that once you're able to understand the intent, could you then imbue that into a robot as a way of helping them interact better with humans?
So there's a classic separation in robotics, which is perception, cognition, and action. And I've always felt that this separation, it's an illusion. There's an illusion of separation between perception, cognition, and action. Rather, in the brain, these things are much more likely, far stronger interconnected. These problems are much more integrated. And when we say, understanding something and reacting to it, most likely that separation isn't that strong. In the form of in the act of sensing and interpreting it, in the act of planning, there's a lot of feedback that goes on, and it's one joint problem. I don't see them necessarily as being separate. And another way of saying that is that actually creating robots that can react and interact with people may very well be necessary in solving this problem of creating a language for them. It is task dependent. It has to be driven by solving some real problem.
So I mean, that's some pretty great advancements so far. But is there anything that we could bring to the table that would help him go beyond human sensing? Is there any way we can enhance his senses to almost superhuman levels? Before I answer that, I think I would want to say that the current state of the art in terms of machines being able to interpret human behavior, we're far behind humans right now. We, in the sense of researchers who are trying to make machines perceive social signals. It's the state of the art is far behind where humans are. But the reason why there is promise is because we can have machines, use sensors that exceed what we have biologically. For instance, our eyes only see a small portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, right? So we only see from violets to reds. Whereas machines could have sensors that see in the infrared range, in the ultraviolet range, and beyond. So the information coming in can be much richer for machines to interpret than what humans have. And that's just the electromagnetic spectrum, as there are many other sensors such as pressure, temperature, other things as well, right? That you could think these machines may have. So without question, once we do figure out ways solving the hard problem of interpreting these, representing them, and figuring out how to act upon those representations, there is no reason why the same sort of algorithms and techniques couldn't be applied to a much wider suite of sensors as well. Is there any way that Batman would be able to have these increased senses as part of his kind of body and mind rather than reading from a screen? Or would he be able to learn to receive these inputs and represent them?
Brilliant, yes. I mean, one of the things that makes me cringe a lot when I see, the representations they show with Terminator, other movies as well, these kind of flickering histograms inside the field of view, that always, tells me that somebody hasn't thought this through well, right? It's unlikely that Batman would ever see numbers flashing in his field of view and, a histogram flashing or a curve flashing. These are extremely distracting. And what you're suggesting is much closer to what the design should be if we can figure out how to do it, which is, of course, something which doesn't divert the person's attention, which sort of augments naturally. This suggests some sort of brain-computer interface, and maybe that's the way to go. But there may be, simpler ways of doing this. People have tried these displays that are more tactile. That people wear on their back or their torso, and that's been useful in transmitting some low frequency information to people.
This may well be outside of your domain, but is there any reason why the brain couldn't interpret those extra areas of vision if it was given the appropriate inputs? Is it the eyes that are the blocker?
It is outside my area of expertise. I was speaking with a psychologist at CMU a couple of months back, and I'd made the point that the brain has a specialized area to process the face, and he corrected me and he said that actually that's not true. The brain is incredibly plastic, and actually, what the part of our brain that we use to interpret faces at such fine detail, it's often fired whenever we need to do anything at fine detail. So there's a very good chance that due to the plasticity of the brain, it would be able to interpret other signals if they were coming in. And in that sense, again, I'll say this as a non-expert, but it is likely that the eyes themselves are the limit.
Do you have anything else that we could like to explore, maybe?
No, as it always works with in research, I think it's you always start with an interesting problem, and I'm sure in the discussions with Batman, many new interesting technologies and ideas will arise.
Today we've talked about a lot of great technologies that we can bring to help Batman be more than a man and help him in his fight against crime in Gotham. Thanks very much to Yaser for joining us.
Thank you.
And if you'd like to find out more about some of Yaser and his team's research, Google OpenPose, that's OPEN space POSE, for more details and videos. If you'd like to discuss your research on a future episode, email us at info@figshare.com.